Lewis did believe in purgatory, which is a slightly unusual position for him to have held as an Anglican. Anglicans typically don't talk much about purgatory. But Lewis thought that it was just a sort of logical necessity, apart from anything else, that, quite aside from, biblical or traditional warrants for purgatory, just logically, he thought it was necessary because most Christians, when they die, are not in a perfect state of complete sanctity. We still have some way to go to achieve perfection. So if we die in an imperfect state, how is it that we will ever enter into the courts of the Lord in heaven, where nothing unclean can enter? We know that from the book of Revelation. God dwells in unapproachable light, and in him there is no darkness at all. So if we want to get into God's home, we must become full of light ourselves. But we die when we're still, to a certain extent, to varying degrees, benighted. So how do we get from the one state to the other? And Lewis calls that process purgatory. It's the cleaning up operation. It's the boot room, as it were. You come in muddy to the house and you take off your muddy boots before you go into the well-carpeted living room. Now, the precise processes that go on in that condition of the soul that we call purgatory aren't things that Lewis gets into in any detail. He just says it must exist. It must be a spiritual reality of some kind. And his favorite image for purgatory is, as he says in Letters to Malcolm, his book on prayer, is drawn from the dentist's chair, that when the tooth of this life is drawn and we are coming round from the anesthetic, we will hear a voice say to us, rinse your mouth out with this, and this will be purgatory. A very ingenious image to talk about it. So that's how he understood purgatory. And also in Letters to Malcolm, he distinguishes that understanding of purgatory from one which focuses excessively on pains, purgatorial pains. That they may be part of it, but they're not the essence of it. The whole point of purgatory is that it's a cleansing process orientated towards heaven. And it's for those who are already saved. It's for Christians. Purgatory is not a second chance, as it were. It's not a place where you can, as it were, change your answer and say, oh, in this life I washed my hands of God and Christ, but in the afterlife I'll change my mind. No. Your mind is made up at the point of death. But for those who have made up their minds in favor of Christ, I'm speaking very crudely here, the last cleansing operations will go on in this place or this state called purgatory.
Yes. Lewis reminds me in his writings a lot of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, and they sound very similar in so many places. Joseph Ratzinger really focuses so much on the heart that, we don't need to even worry about how long it is. It's what the heart needs. It's the heart's time. And Lewis will talk about how it's not so much the idea of suffering. It's more about like whatever treatment is necessary. That's what you're going to get. And so they sound very similar in so many places. And I think it's because they're both talking about this idea about our hearts and us becoming fully restored to who we're supposed to be, so we can be plugged into the communion of saints, holy and fully alive. Absolutely.
Because if our heart isn't purified, then we won't find heaven very heavenly, because we'll still be out of sync with it to a certain extent. We won't be in the groove. So our heart does need that fine tuning in order to make heaven heavenly for us. And that's what Lewis depicts so powerfully in The Great Divorce, where you remember there are various characters who go to heaven from a grey town, a mysterious grey town. They take a bus ride up to heaven or the outskirts of heaven, and there they meet various angels or bright spirits whom they had known in this life, in this world. And they get into conversation with those bright spirits, and the bright spirits try to beckon them further in, further up and further in, you might even say, from Narnia. But they've all these visitors from the grey town have got various besetting sins, various residual problems, and none of them want to give up on those precious, cunning bosom sins, except one man, and that's a man whose besetting sin is lust, and that lust is depicted symbolically by a red lizard on his shoulder who keeps flicking his tail and whispering into the man's ear. And the bright spirit says to that man, "Can I kill it? Can I kill the lizard?" And the man says, "Well, no, I don't think you can. Why don't he'll be quiet? I'll make sure he doesn't whisper too much." and they have this back and forth, and eventually the man realizes that the lizard has to be killed. That there's no way of entering into the heavenly courts unless the lizard is done away with absolutely. The epigraph to the Great Divorce is a line from George MacDonald, where MacDonald says, "Out Satan must go, every hair and feather." Not even one hair of Satan can be found on our clothing, as it were, if we're to get into heaven. And that's where Lewis gets the title of the book from, The Great Divorce. We must be divorced from all our residual sins, however small, however seemingly unimportant. William Blake, the Romantic poet, had talked about the marriage of heaven and hell, as if you could somehow yoke dark and light together. Lewis writes of their divorce. They've got to be utterly separated, because what concord does Christ have with Belial? To quote St. Paul, no concord at all. And it's quite a tragic book, actually, because only one of these visitors from hell makes the right decision, and he undergoes this painful process of being divorced from his lust. All the others prefer their safety, that what they know, and they all eventually go back to the grey town. And they discover that is hell, that they've always been in hell, in fact. Whereas the lizard man discovers that the grey town was only purgatory in his case. That his heart had always actually been rightly disposed to heaven, and now it was just undergoing the last corrections prior to being received into the rose-red brightness of that everlasting morning, to quote a beautiful phrase from the book.